We all desires to be a person, a man or a woman after God's own heart. And as we find here in our reading in 1 Samuel chapter 18, just to catch us up a little bit, if you remember last week, of course, we examined the familiar tale of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And then 1 Samuel 18, as God would have it, comes directly after chapter 17. So David is coming into his own. He has been called by God. He has been anointed the next king of Israel, though he has not taken the throne. He has chosen rather, and God has chosen rather, for him to wait in the wings and pay his dues and grow into the king that God wants him to be. And that's something that we could learn a lot from David. The fact that God prepares us and brings us along slowly. I wasn't young when I surrendered to preach. I was in my 30s. You know, I wasn't like some of these preacher boys. They surrendered to preach when like 16, 17 years old. I was in my 30s. And I remember not too long after I had surrendered to preach, there was a church that called and asked me if I would consider to come and be their pastor. And I said, I am not ready. They said, well, sure you are. You're in your 30s. No, that didn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything at all. We have to learn patience to grow into what God wants us to be, and then God puts us where he wants us. But here in 1 Samuel chapter 18, we see David truly growing into greatness. And when you think about that word greatness and what it means to be great, what do you think about? Have you ever been in the presence of greatness before? I remember when I was in high school, I was a senior in high school, and there was a basketball player named O.J. Mayo. I'm sure I've mentioned him a few times from the pulpit. O.J. Was in 7th grade when I was a senior at Rose Hill Christian School, and O.J. was a phenom. And I'll see some of these boys, nothing against this local talent, but I'll hear people say, boy, that boy's a good basketball player. He could go a long way. When you see somebody that's going to go to the NBA, you know you're in the presence of greatness of an athlete. In 7th grade, he was dunking on seniors on the playground. I mean, he was like a man playing amongst boys. You just knew. You could see that. He was different. He walked different. He played different. He dribbled different. And so now, after being able to see someone at such a young age that has so much greatness in them, and I'm a huge basketball fan, of course, and I'll tell Candace they'll be talking about some local boy, or I'll see some boy on the news. They'll say, man, he's going to go great. He's going to do great things. He'll be in the NBA. And I'm like, nah, he's not. He's not. Because you know when you're in the presence of that athletic greatness, they're different. They look different. They play different. But what about greatness in life? Do you equate greatness with great wealth? You know, I've had the privilege and honor of meeting some very wealthy people in my life. And I'll be honest with you, I wasn't impressed with any of them. I've had the privilege and honor of sitting across the table from men and women that people consider great. Oh, you're in the presence of greatness. And I just wasn't all that impressed. You know, I've had the opportunity to shake hands with senators and congressmen and even presidential candidates over my lifetime. And I have never thought, man, they're great. But you know what? I have been in the presence of greatness before when I sat at a dining room table with men like Roy Humble, who was one of the greatest biblical minds I ever knew. I knew I was in the presence of greatness. I felt like I was in the presence of greatness when I had the opportunity to meet Andy Sexton. And I thought, man, I am in the presence of greatness. So how do we gauge greatness? And David here, you have to remember, at this point in David's life, he is only in his late teens and maybe early 20s. He's a young man. But even at this young age, we can see in our text that he is great. That when people are with him, they are in the presence of greatness, because God does not measure greatness by your athletic ability or your monetary value or your political influence. That's not how he measures greatness. It's not an academic achievement. It's not the number of degrees that we hang upon our walls. God does not measure greatness in that way. True greatness is not measured by what you can achieve in your life, but how you live your life. So let's look here in 1 Samuel chapter 18, and Steve Bateman is going to love this, because I'm going to have to wear these because I'm missing too many words when I read So let's begin reading in 1 Samuel chapter 18, and Steve will take a picture here in just a moment. 1 Samuel 18, beginning in verse 5. 1 Samuel 18 and verse 5 says this, "And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. It came to pass, as they came when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets and with joy and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth at the saying, and it displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and unto me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hand as the other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided it out of the presence twice. And Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him and had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from him and made him his captain over thousands, and went out and came in before the people. And David behaved himself wisely in all ways, and the Lord was with him. So we see here in these first 15 verses that David is coming into greatness. He has greatness in his life. We're going to look and see how we can have this greatness, and how you can perceive when you're in the presence of greatness. Whenever they come back from war, the women are meeting them in the streets singing, Saul, Saul has slain his thousands. That made Saul feel really great. And then they saw the young, strapping, ruddy young man David come up behind him, and they said, David, David has slain his tens of thousands. His greatness was measured abroad and was proclaimed. As a young man in his late teens, he killed a giant with a slingshot. I mean, he became a legend. Could you imagine if somebody killed a giant with a slingshot today? If this happened today, it'd be all over social media. I mean, listen, social media is so prevalent that you would have thought World War III was going to break out, because Cracker Barrel took the old man the side of the barrel off. I mean, I was like, who cares? You know, the last time I did a Cracker Barrel was like 15 years ago. It doesn't bother me in the least. If I want good old-fashioned home cooking, I go to my mama's house. It's the same thing, and it's a lot cheaper. It's free there. But, you know, could you imagine, though, had David killed Goliath today as he did then? It would be everywhere. It would be viral. It would be all over the place. And even back then, without Telegram, without the U.S. Postal Service, without the internet or Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat, without anything, David's fame spread abroad throughout Israel like wildfire. This kid was great. So how do we know? How can we see? Let's break it down, and that way we can see about the presence of greatness, how you can know. The presentation of David's life. The presentation of David's life lets us know that he's great. 3 times in the chapter we're told, quote, David behaved himself wisely. This phrase speaks to walking properly, to a person who knows how to carry themselves. David behaved himself wisely. David did the things that he should have done. He walked the walk and he talked the talk, and he did the things that a man should do. He behaved as a godly person. He did things, and he walked accurately and carefully. He was someone that whenever he presented himself before the people, he presented himself the right way. He presented himself as a God-fearing man should. So we see in verse 5 that he behaved himself well in spite of life's promotions. Look with me in verse 5. What does it say? And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set before him over men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Verse 5, and he went out whithersoever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. He behaved well. He behaved himself well in spite of the promotions. Now, could you imagine being like 19, 20 years old, you kill a giant with a slingshot, and everybody in Israel now knows your name, and you're super famous across the entire country. You go from a nobody from nowhere in Bethlehem, keeping sheep one day, to being the talk of the town the next. And then to add to that, Saul takes this 19-year-old, 20-year-old boy and sets him in charge over what the Bible describes as, quote, men of war, battle-hardened warriors in Israel. Most of the people that fought in the army of Israel were farmers, and they were carpenters, and they worked the field, they raised cotton, they raised wheat, they raised grapes, they had vineyards. They weren't warriors. So when the Bible says that they were men of war, that's all they did. They were warriors. These were the special forces. These were the elite. This weren't the weekend warriors like I was. These are the special forces. These are the Navy SEALs. And they accepted him. Could you imagine if you were a battle-hardened soldier and then all of a sudden this kid that's only killed one person his entire life, he's killed a lion and a bear and a giant. That's the only people he's ever killed. And Saul shows up and he says, this is David. He's my boy. He just killed Goliath and now he's in charge of all you people. And they probably killed thousands of people with their bare hands. And they looked at him, but what? They accepted him. They said, yeah, we'll follow him. We'll follow him anywhere. He behaved himself wisely in spite of that promotion. Because one of the biggest downfalls for a Christian, you know that you're not in the presence of greatness whenever they begin to succeed and then they're puffed up in pride. How many times have you seen it? The pastor from the little old country church, and nobody knows his name, and then all of a sudden God gives growth in the church and God causes expansion in the ministry, and he goes from somebody that's pastoring, 50 people to now he's pastoring 500 people, and then he's pastoring 1,000 people, and then he has this humongous church and he's pastoring thousands of people. He cranks out a couple books, and then he's so puffed up in pride that you can't even recognize the man that used to be in the pulpit a few years before. You see, you behave yourself wisely in spite of promotions. David was still the same David the day that Saul gave him the men as he was the day before. In spite of the promotion, he still behaved himself wisely. He didn't get puffed up in pride. He gave all the glory to God. He never said, look what I did. He said, look what God's given me. So you see him doing that. That's how you know you're in the presence of greatness. But then he behaved himself well in spite of life's problems. Look with me in verse 14. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. What happens immediately before that in verse 12, in verse 11, 12, and 13? David is playing his harp for Saul. Now remember, this is after he's made David the captain over the men of war. I mean, David is now a war hero. David is now a man in charge. And what does he do? He's still humble in spite of that promotion. He's still, when Saul needs him, he goes and he plays his harp for him, just like the shepherd boy did a few weeks before. And he's playing his harp for Saul, and Saul gets so enraged and so mad, and he gets so jealous of David, he has a javelin in his hand, and he slings it at David, and he tries to, quote, pin him against the wall. He tries to kill David, not once, but twice. And David still behaved himself wisely, it says in 14, and David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Saul tries to kill him, and then he runs him out of the house. He's so jealous of David, and he's so upset with David because all the people love him that he could just kill him. But what does David do? He doesn't lash out. He doesn't wait till Saul goes to sleep and chop his head off. He doesn't get a sling out and kill him right there in the throne room. David still humbles himself and serves the king in spite of the fact that the king hates him. That's how you know you're behaving yourself wisely. That in spite of problems, you continue on the course that God has put you on, and you don't allow the problems to throw you off your course. Some unexpected problems will blindside us, and if we're not careful, we will not behave ourselves wisely. The sign of true greatness is one whose faith has the ability to continue to walk right and do right even when things in life aren't right. Because anybody can serve God and walk wisely and walk upright whenever things are going great. But when problems come, that's when you just see where the real greatness lies. And David still behaves himself wisely in spite of life's problems, in spite of the fact that Saul wants to kill him. And then we see that he behaved himself wisely. If you look in verse 30 of 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 30 says this. 1 Samuel, let me make sure I got that right. Yeah, 1 Samuel 18 and verse 30. Then the princes of the Philistines went forth, and came to pass after they went forth that David behaved himself wisely, more wisely than all the servants of Saul, that his name was much set apart. David, through the providence of God, he is way more popular than Saul. People love him. People adore him. He marries into Saul's family. And then David is being blessed greatly. He's prospering greatly. And he is still behaving himself wisely in spite of life's possibilities. You see, there's all these possibilities set before David. He's married into the king's family. He's the heir apparent to the throne of Israel. Even the Philistines respect him in battle, and all the men of war now follow him and everything he says. And he is a life chock filled with possibilities and promise, and he still behaves himself wisely in spite of the fact that everybody tells him he's great. One of the worst things that can happen to you when you're serving God is people start recognizing that, start telling you how great you are and what potential you have, and then you believe them. Don't read your own press. That's what I've always told my son, my daughter. Don't read your own press. When people bring you up so high and they look and they see all the possibilities that you have and all the potential that you have in your life, don't buy into it. Don't buy into what everyone is telling you that you should do. Doubtless there were people in David's ears, you should just take the throne now. You have the support of the army. You're married into the king's family. You might as well just go ahead and take the throne. All this possibilities, all this promise. Just go ahead. Just get ahead of God and do it now. In spite of all the possibilities and all the life's possibilities that were laying out in front of David, the fact that he could have taken the kingdom, the fact that he could have killed Saul, the fact that he could have led the armies at this ripe old age of 19 or 20, he waited on God's timing. And he did not take over and put things in his timing. That's how you know you're in the presence of greatness. He waited on God's timing, and he didn't get ahead of God. When you feel like you're on the way up, there's a tendency to toot your own horn and to say, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. This is how we're going to do this. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to force this. We're just going to force this. God has already shown me that I can do these things, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it now. But see, David, in spite of all these possibilities and all this that he possessed, he still waited on God. He waited his turn. I know I talk a lot about sports, but I think of like Arch Manning. I mean, this kid's royalty. He's football royalty. If you don't know who the Mannings are, you probably have never watched football. You live under a rock. I mean, this kid, his granddaddy was a football legend. His uncles are football legends. And here's Arch Manning, and he went to Texas, and he could have went and started quarterback anywhere in the country. I personally was praying that he would go to UK and bring us some victory in football, but of course, that didn't happen. But he went to Texas, and here this kid that everybody wanted sat on the bench his freshman year, sat on the bench his sophomore year, and now only his junior year is he getting to play. Why? Why would you do that, man? You should just go somewhere and play and just have all this potential. He's respecting the process, and he's growing where he is, and he'll be better because of it. That's exactly what David understood. He wasn't ready to be king yet. If he were ready to be king, God would have told him it was time to be king. So in spite of the possibilities and all the promise in his life, he still behaved himself wisely. The way that David presents himself in his life and behaving wisely in all these things, that's how you know you're in the presence of greatness. Second thing we see are the priorities in David's life. Look with me in verse 9 quickly. Verse 9 says this. Verse 9 says, "And saw I David from that day forward." You see, David is young, but his priorities are right. Saul hates David. He eyes him from that day forward. But in spite of the fact that he is despised by the current king, he still keeps his priorities straight. He remains faithful to his priorities. He carried on with his assignments. He did all the things he was supposed to do. He led the men that Saul gave to him. He didn't go and tell Saul what he wanted to do. He waited, and he had his priorities straight. The king said, lead these men. He led these men. The king said, okay, you're leading this men. Now come and play the harp for me. And he still came and he played the harp. His priorities were in line. The priorities of David's life, we see that he was surrendered in verse 10. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul as he prophesied in the midst of the house of David, and played with his hand and as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. David was surrendered. He knew the king was against him. He knew the king had his eye on him. He knew the king was jealous of him, but still he walked in the throne room, he picked up his harp, and he played because that was his job. He was surrendered to do what he had committed to do. His priority was that he was surrendered. He was steadfast. Look with me in verse 11. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. He was steadfast. That tells me that Saul threw the javelin at David one day while he was playing his harp and tried to nail him to the wall with it. And David came back in and continued to play the harp. He said, this is my job. I'm going to do it until God tells me to stop. Man, he was steadfast. The priorities that David had in his life, to be completely surrendered, to be completely humble, to be completely steadfast. It doesn't matter if he tries to kill me. It's my job. I'm going to go and do it. I've got a job to do. And we see that he was submissive in verse 13. Therefore Saul removed him from him and made him his captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. He was submissive. Even after Saul tries to kill him, not once but twice, Saul says, this is what I want you to do. And he said, yes, sir. And he went to it. Man, I wish we could find employees like that today, don't you? You can't even find employees show up on time for work today. They think that if you say your shift is 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., they think that's just a suggestion. You know, it's like a speed limit. It's a suggestion. 7 a.m., they show up at 7:45, 8 o'clock, no excuse. You know what my dad taught me when I was growing up? If you're early, you're on time. If you're on time, you're late. If you're late, you're fired. That's what my dad said. And that's what he was. He was surrendered and steadfast and submissive. Even though he served a king whose his hand had left him, even though he served a king who hated him with all the rage inside of him, he still humbled himself and submitted to the authority of the king. The priorities in David's life should be ours if we want to be truly great, surrendered and steadfast and submissive. You see, in these three verses, David sets a good example. Often the difference between average Christians and great Christians comes down to a matter of their priorities. I think of a man named Byron Fox. He's a great preacher. He's a great piano player. He's a great songwriter. Byron Fox is one of those men that I look up to, and when I talk to him, I feel like I'm in the presence of greatness. And I remember Byron Fox telling me one time how surrendered and steadfast and submissive he was to God, and he was talking about preaching, And he said, yeah, you should read a text at least, I think he said you have to read a text 100 times before you can preach out of it. And I don't doubt he does it because he typically reads, 10 to 20 chapters in the morning before he does anything else. I mean, this is the guy that, in my opinion, is one of the greatest biblical minds around, but he still has those same priorities. He's still surrendered and steadfast and submissive to God. You see, these are important. Those things that you attach value to determine the priorities in your life. If God is the most valuable thing in your life, that's going to be your priority in your life. If money is the most important thing in your life, that's going to take all the priority in your life. If that's the most important thing, if being successful in business is the most important thing, then that's what you're going to have. All your priorities are going to surround that. People, they want to be good parents, and you should want to be good parents. And then that becomes their priorities, and they surround all their priorities are around their children. And I've said this before, husbands and wives that do this, and it's so sad. Like their whole life is just their kids. It's softball and basketball and baseball and track and field hockey and whatever they want to do. And we got to travel here and travel there and buy $5,000 cheerleading pom-poms. And then the kids grow up and they move out, and what happens? Mom and dad get divorced. Why? Because their marriage was never a priority. The kids were. Those kids weren't there when you got married, and guess what? They're going to be gone, and you're still going to be married. So your marriage better be a priority. Look out. Man, you didn't know he's going to get marriage counseling too tonight. That's free. You don't have to do anything with that. But because God was a priority in David's life, we see that he becomes great in God and a man after God's own heart. Now let's look at the perception of David's life. The way people perceived David. The people talked about his greatness. It can be seen by others around him. In verse 7 through 9, let's see real quick. Let's look at the private perception of David's life. Look with me in verse 7 of our text of chapter 18. Verse 7 says this, and the women answered one another as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, they were ascribed unto David 10,000. They say they ascribed but 1,000. But what can he have more but the kingdom? And saw I David from that day forward. Look with me down in verse 15. Wherefore when Saul saw that the behaved him very wisely, he was afraid of him. And look with me in verse 29. We see this. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. The private perception of David is this. How King Saul perceived David? He hated David. He wanted David dead. And then he looked at David and he was jealous of David, and then he was scared to death of David. So this private perception that Saul has of David shows his greatness. The fact that this young boy that's only 19, 20 years old, and Saul is jealous of him. And then Saul is so angry with him, he wants him dead. And then in the end, Saul is scared to death of him. And the power that David possesses over the people, and the power that David has received from God. And Saul is very aware that God has removed his hand from him and placed it on David. So the private perception of David's life, how King Saul perceives David, this shows his greatness. The public perception of David, that how people in Israel perceived him. Saul's private perception of David was one thing, but the public perceived him an entirely different way. Saul's servants, look with me in verse 5. How does Saul's servants see him? These are the people that should be loyal to Saul. In verse 5 it says this, and David went whithersoever Saul sent him and behaved himself wisely, and Saul set him out to be over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Saul's servants, they perceived David as a great man that carried himself well, and they were impressed with this young boy that had killed the giant, and they perceived him as a great leader. Saul's subjects in verse 5, we see that they perceived him as a great man of war, and God's hand was on him. In verse 16, it's reiterated, but all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. In verse 30, we see this: the princes of the Philistines went forth, and it came to pass after they went forth that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so his name was much set by. In other words, it was greatly praised. He was set apart. Saul's servants respected and loved him. Saul's subjects saw him as a great man of God. And then Saul's son and daughter loved him. In verse 1 through 4, we see this: and it came to pass, when he had made an end of the speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would let him go no more home to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him, and he gave it to David and his garments, even as his sword and his bow and his girdle. Saul's family loved David. Jonathan loved David like his own brother. In verse 20, we see that Saul's daughter preferred David to her father. And Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And then in verse 28, we see again, verse 28 says this: and Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. So the public perception of David's life was this: his servants loved him, Saul's servants loved him, Saul's soldiers loved him, Saul's own family preferred David to Saul. So the perception of David, the public perception, was a great one. But David's personal perception of his life, I want you to make note how David perceived himself. Look with me in verse 17. This is the mark of true greatness. People around him perceives him as this great man. Saul perceives him as this great threat. But look how David perceives himself in verse 17. And Saul said unto David, behold, now my elder daughter Merab, her will I give thee to wife. Only be thou vigilant, valiant for me, and the fight of the Lord's battles for Saul. And said, let not my hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. And David said unto Saul, who am I? And what is my life, or my father's family in Israel, that I should be a son-in-law to the king? David perceives himself as nobody from nowhere still. You want to know the mark of true greatness? How you know you're in the presence of true greatness? They're not aware of the fact they're great. If people tell you, spend all the time telling you how great they are, they're not great. They're just simply not. Because if they're great, they don't have to tell you they're great. And they have no concept of the fact that they're so great. That's a sign of true greatness. Humility in a Christian is something that has to be there before you can say there are truly great Christians. Truly great people never talk about their greatness. Truly great people are always more excited to see you than you are to see them. Truly great people admire people far more than they admire themselves. That's why I have a problem with some preachers. Man, they really admire themselves. They get up in the morning, look in the mirror, and they say, boy, God really got something when he got me. I'm the greatest preacher ever walked. I got the greatest mind. I'm handsome and smart. And gosh, I'm great. They have that perception of themselves. You can tell, too. Because you go to talk to them and they just tell you how great they are. And they explain to you why they're so much holier than thou. True greatness, the perception, your self-perception, is that you are not great. That's how you know you're in the presence of true greatness. What does it say in Proverbs 27:2? Let another man praise thee and not thine own mouth, a stranger and not thine own lips. Proverbs 26:12, seest thou a wise man in his own conceit? There is more hope of a fool than of him. 2 Corinthians 10:12, for we dare not make ourselves of the number or compare ourselves with the some of the commanded selves, but every measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves amongst themselves are not wise. Boy, I'm great. I'm great. You're great. We're all great. Let's just go be great together. That's what that's saying. That's not greatness. You see, the people around him, Saul perceives him as a threat. The public perceives him as a great man, but David perceives himself as nothing more than a humble shepherd boy. There's nothing great in me, David says. It's only God that's great. That's how you know you're in the presence of greatness. So let's look at the power of David's life quickly in verse 12. This is how you see greatness, the power, the presence of greatness. In verse 12, we see this. Look at the power. And Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. What's it say in verse 14? And David behaved himself wisely in all of his ways, and the Lord was with him. You know you're in the presence of greatness, and you have greatness in your life by the power you have of God in your life. How did David have this power? Well, he had it because of his relationship with the Lord. Remember, it was David who wrote the words in Psalms 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." David had a relationship with God where God was the shepherd and he was the dumb sheep in the mud. The relationship that David had with God was one that we've looked at and said it 1,000 times as a man after God's own heart. Not a perfect man, not a pious man, but a man after God's own heart. I say that sometimes it's hard to be in the presence of greatness amongst some Christians because their piety gets them so high up on themselves and they forget they're just a dumb sheep in the dirt. And God's the one that is great. You see the relationship, what it says when David was a man after God's own heart, not that he was perfect, but that he was humbly following the shepherd. You see David's relationship with God, but then also David's resource in the Lord. The Bible says that God was with him over and over and over again. So, how is it that we can have greatness in our lives? Just like David. Exactly like David. True greatness is found in a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, first off. But then, once we're saved, we die to ourselves, we put ourselves where we belong and put God where he belongs. We never think that we're too good for a job. Never look at God and say, "God, I'm too good to do that." I heard somebody say one time, and God help this person, they had we were members of a church and went to this church, and they had a nursery ministry where like ladies were, listed in the bulletin to be in the nursery. And so ladies would volunteer for this every year, and they were on a rotation like we do children's church. I heard a lady say this one time, "I've done my time in the nursery." And I thought, how arrogant, how pious. I've done my time. I'm above that now. I'm above that. I remember one time hearing a story, watching a documentary about Billy Graham. And they were talking about he went to death row to witness to men on death row. They weren't allowed to come to the service he had in the prison, so he asked the warden permission to go to death row. Well, of course, he's Billy Graham, so yeah, we'll let you go to death row. So he went down and he talked to the men, and of course there was a photographer there, and he told the photographer, he said, "Don't take any pictures while we're in here. I don't want you to take any pictures of this." And Billy Graham went from prison cell to prison cell, and there were solid doors, and you couldn't see, and there was just a food slit. And this man who had preached to tens of thousands of people got down in the dirty, nasty floor and preached through the slot to those men that were going to die. And then there's a very famous picture that was only published after Billy Graham's death, where he led a man to the Lord, and that man's hand was reaching out, and Billy Graham on his face in the dirt, holding his hand, praying with somebody that nobody else wanted to talk to. The photographer said, "I took the picture knowing that Mr. Graham didn't want me to." He said, "And I respected his wishes, and I never told the story, and I never published it until after he died, because he was so humble in the fact that it wasn't about him, it was about the man in the cell." Listen, that's what greatness is. It's not having your name in lights or everyone knowing who you are, but serving God humbly and getting down in the dirt and never being too good to do anything for God. I used to train a lot of people and taught a lot of classes for nursing assistants and nurses over the years and orientation. And I always tell them, I'll never ask you to do anything that I wouldn't do. And then they would be surprised when I would go and, give the bed bath with them. I can't believe you're doing this. Well, why would I not? We're all just working here. Why, as Christians, do we not feel like we're in the presence of greatness now like we used to with other Christians? It's because we've all become too good to do anything for God. David was great. We should not desire to be great so that people will sing our praises. We should desire to do great things for God. And when we put ourselves in that place where it's not about me, it's all about God, it's all about what God does, then we may not see it. And if you're truly doing great things for God, you won't see it. When people talk about, oh, they do great things, you'll be like, I don't even know what they're talking about. Because that is what true greatness is, losing yourself in the service to God. Let's all bow our heads quickly. I thank God that I feel like I'm in the presence of greatness with people at our church, I thank God for that we have great saints of God here, and some that when I tell them that or I brag on them, they get embarrassed because I'm nothing. But that's the greatness. It's not us. We're not great. It's God that's great. We serve a great God. So thankful to get to serve with great Christians that don't even realize their greatness. Dear God, I come to you and I thank you so much for this evening. God, I thank you for allowing us to have greatness, not because of how great we are, God, but to have you, God, your greatness inside of us. God, I pray we'll always perceive ourselves as humble servants, because that's what we are, just tools in your hand. God, I pray that we'll always just humble ourselves, and everything we do in your power. God, that everything that happens comes through our relationship, first and foremost with you, and then we rely solely on your power and your guidance. God, I pray to have the heart of David, to always be after your heart and your will, and God, to never get ahead of you, God, to always walk behind you as you lead, and God, to remain humble, and God, to just get down and do what needs to be done as David did. God, I do thank you for those that serve you, and God, serve you so humbly and so steadfastly. God, I pray that we'll all just follow this example of David, and God, never, ever, ever lose sight of the fact that it is you that is great and we are weak. In Jesus' name, amen.